Hey there, I'm Ken with the Shop Mini RC, and today we are opening one of these guys. I know there's a lot of box openings of these, but we're going to open this guy up because we just happened to get one so we can do some comparison videos and show the differences. But I also want to walk through what opening a new SCX24 looks like and what you should check when you do open one. There have been some people, and I actually got one as well, where they've opened it up and some of the wheels have been tight and just some stuff is not 100%. So you should definitely take some time and kind of check things before you go off and just try to run it, and then you wonder why something burned up quickly. So, all right, let's get this thing open. All right, so this guy, if you've got nothing, if you have absolutely nothing, then I guess you can use this just always when you're charging your LiPos. Be in the room, be around it, don't let it charge overnight, don't let it just sit there. Proper LiPo care, super important. We're gonna post a video over here about batteries and just the different kinds of batteries and whatnot, but also some LiPo safety. Ideally, upgrade your charger. Get a good hobby grade charger. Spend 60, 70 bucks, get a good hobby grade charger. I mean, you don't even have to get a super expensive one, but something that can at least tell you the voltage balance and balance charge. These are not ideal, but the new versions of these are definitely better than the old ones, so we don't use these at all. So it looks like the Gladiator just comes with an extra drive shaft and body mount. So that's cool. I wish it was a whole drive shaft, just one whole drive shaft. That would be nice. Another thing of note in regards to the batteries, and this applies to pretty much all RCs, never leave your battery plugged into your rig, or your car, or your boat, or your airplane, or whatever. Never leave the battery just plugged in. It'll slowly, a lot of them, especially these version 2s, it even says, right? Unplug, do not charge while in vehicle. The ESC will actually, even if it's off, will slowly drain the battery. And if your battery, if a LiPo hits 0 volts, or really below 3, you start to worry, risk damage and whatnot. So make sure you unplug your battery from your rig. Never leave it plugged in. In fact, almost all my rigs are always set to on. They're just on. And even when we decase these receivers, we will remove the on and off switch and just have it permanently on, because we always remove these. So never leave them in there. Just get in the habit of always pulling them out, which is why I just leave them on, because there's no reason to have it on and off if you're just going to unplug the battery every time anyway. So make sure you do that. So some of the things just to kind of check for and generally keep an eye on, especially with a brand new one, or if you're picking up a used rig from somebody, always just check your wheels. I know it just seems obvious, but if you're brand new and you've never ever purchased an RC, or maybe this is your first SCX24 and you've got bigger ones, or maybe even built kits, from the ground up, but you've never built a ready to run, the factories aren't perfect, right? And so these could be over tightened, and if you just throw your battery in there, you could end up burning stuff up pretty quickly. I had somebody basically get 5 minutes of runtime out of their truck and it burned up, and it's because one of their wheels was super tight and they didn't realize it and it fried. Okay, so that's the main thing. You can also just make sure your steering doesn't seem like it's over tight, right? These have a little bit of play in them, so you should be able to see at the knuckles that they're turning pretty easily. I'm not really putting much pressure on it at all, and it moves just fine. Okay, so all that's good. You want to check your links. Okay. Another thing you can do before you start running is check your phasing. Now, phasing is where your drive shaft, front and rear on the same drive shaft, the front part of the drive shaft going into your axle and the one coming out of the transfer case or transmission is in phase. And what that means is the easiest way to do this is the screw where you screw them in is facing the exact same direction. But really what it is, it's about these ears of the drive shaft being the same. So the drive shaft has from an ear to ear, right? So these are not in phase. You can see here, this drive shaft ear, let's turn this a little bit, should be straight in line with this drive shaft ear, but you can tell that it's not. So this shaft here needs to be pulled out and realigned. And we're gonna go ahead and do that right now. So The easiest way to do this is just to pop off the link. The link is a 0.05 screw. We can just pull this link out. And this link. And now basically this can flip forward and they pop out. What you want is to have your screw hole here facing straight up. Okay, and once you've got your screw hole here facing straight up and your screw hole here facing straight up, you can go ahead and put your shaft back in. It turned. I know it's hard for you guys to see, but I'm making sure that this is aligned as we go back together. Okay, so there you see, both shafts ends are facing the same direction. And what that does is this ear right here and this ear right here allows the movement of the drive shaft to basically move in sync. So that way you don't have one side go while it's spinning and you're articulating, you don't have one ear pushing against the other ear while the other one's not. It's not a huge deal on these because they're not going crazy fast, but if they're not in sync, they can cause vibration at higher speeds. They can cause bumping, stuff like that. So just make sure that you check your phase here and get them lined up. We're going to do the back as well, and then we'll continue. And when you're putting these back in, any screw or nut or bolt, do not over tighten. These are small and they're plastic, so over tightening happens very easily. And if you strip them out, there's not really an easy fix. I mean, there are some easy fixes. You can throw some super glue down in the hole and kind of build up the hole, or use some thread lock. Quick note about thread lock while we're talking about it. There is a plastic safe thread lock, but all the rest of the thread locks are not plastic safe. So if you're using thread lock like on your servo here, some people will use it in different places. You need to make sure it's going metal to metal. Don't get thread lock on the plastic, or it will literally degrade the plastic and make it fall apart. It'll just crumble. So if you're going to use thread lock on the plastic, it has to be plastic thread lock. So just be sure you do that. I'm going to go ahead and do the rears now. So apparently the Gladiator drive shaft is very long. So we're going to go ahead and pull out one more link. And that gets it so that we can just enough to get it out of there. Okay, and now we can see that our drive shaft is one continuous from ear to ear in phase link, essentially, shaft, right? You can see that the ears are facing the same direction on the shaft as well as on these the rear U-joint portions. Okay, so another thing of note for anybody who's very new, these are worm gears, and worm gears basically don't allow you to turn them from the axle side, essentially. So if you're trying to turn it, it's very difficult. You can see it turned a little there, but it's very difficult to turn. So there's nothing wrong because you don't have freewheeling, right? You shouldn't be able to freewheel. It should be very difficult to turn. You need to turn from the motor side. Now, that being said, I do like to try to turn the drive shaft a little by hand and just kind of feel it. Does it feel like the motor is smooth? Does it feel like everything's spinning without resistance? And it does. It feels nice and smooth. There's a couple things that if it doesn't, it could be something in the transmission binding up, or it could be something in one of the axles. If you do feel something odd and it's binding and it doesn't really want to turn very well, you can start digging deeper. One of the first things to do is just to pull off one of the drive shafts and then turn the side that's still connected and see if the binding goes away, or see if it still feels, see if it feels smooth. And if it does feel like there's still binding, then you know it's on the other side. If we pulled the front off and we try turning it and it still feels like it just doesn't feel smooth, then you'll want to check the rear. If you pull that off, put the front back on, and it still feels binding, then you know it's here, right? Because you've eliminated that it's not here, and it's not here, so it must be here. And then you might want to dig into the transmission, see if there's something going on there. Again, these trucks, they're really easy to work on. Don't be intimidated. Just make sure you keep track of your screws. Don't lose them. Put screws back where they go as you're taking it apart, if you can kind of keep them in an order. We usually lay them out in kind of the order that they come out in. Or you can put them back in the thing you take them out of. But they're pretty easy to work on. So we're going to go ahead and just pull off one of the diffs here and just kind of give you a look inside. So you can see inside the diff here a little bit, and I'm not trying to take the whole thing apart, but I figured I would show you. There is a bearing on the worm gear portion and 2 bearings on the center brass gear. Also, if you do take this thing completely apart, there's an O-ring on this side, and I do believe there's another O-ring and bearing on the inside. There's definitely a bearing, but there should be also another O-ring on the other side of that worm gear. Now, if you find some weird binding going on, sometimes these O-rings, I've seen them break. They're broken off already. Or if you run it and within 5 minutes you start feeling like there's binding going on, it's possible one of these broke and they're getting caught in here. So just be aware that that is a potential point of failure. But yeah, it's just the 2 bearings on the worm gear, 2 bearings on the side of the axle shafts, and the brass gear here. So we're going to go and put this guy back on. Just be aware, this top portion is the truss that holds your rear links. It's kind of hard to see, I'm sorry. There you go, this right here is a truss that holds your rear links, and your diff cover does hold that on with the 2 top screws of the diff cover. And if you're not careful, that could pop off. So don't forget that that's part of that. And the same goes for the front, it's just it's the servo mount. The top 2 screws hold the servo mount in place. And again, while you're putting this back together, if you took your diff cover off, especially if you're putting an aftermarket diff cover on, do not over tighten. That will definitely cause binding in your worm gear. Everything should really just be snug. Okay, so we're all good. The next thing I kind of want to show you is what's behind the wheels. So on your rear and front, you have this hex hub, okay? This hex hub is supposed to sit on this little pin. And now be careful because this little pin will just slide right out and you'll lose it. So when you're taking this hex hub off, or even your wheel, just be sure, because sometimes the hex hub comes off inside the wheel. It's stuck in there. But when you're pulling this off, just be careful not to lose your little pin here. And part of what's happening when you over tighten your wheels is your hex hub, it's got a little groove in it, right? And it's also got this protruding nipple part. And when you put this on there, the pin goes into the groove, but the nipple part hits onto the bearing, and you're pushing on the bearing. So as you tighten this down super tight, you're actually pushing onto the bearing, and that's what's causing binding. So sometimes when you do aftermarket hex hubs or extended hexes and stuff like that, they're not perfect. And so sometimes you need to shave down this nipple a little bit to get the pin and the groove to sit better. And so there's a little bit more room so you can tighten it down a little bit more. Now, you've got to be careful. You don't want to over shave this nipple off, because if you do, you end up like this, and you've got a bunch of space in between your hex and your bearing, and that can just cause a little bit of play, a little sloppiness, could actually cause your axles to bend more easily. And so you do still want this kind of pushing up against your hub, but just barely. It just should be that if this is tight down, you should still have a lot of nice looseness in there. So just be aware of that. That's what's going on here. And if it's not sitting down into the groove all the way, and this pin's not pushing against your hex hub groove, then you're going to end up pushing against the nipple, against the bearing. So again, if you want to kind of alleviate some of that and get yourself a little bit more threading here and be able to tighten it down a little more, you'll have to basically evenly sand down the hex hub nipple. Okay, you want to be even. Okay, another thing, these screws are here strictly to hold the bearing in. If you take these screws out, the whole axle can slide out, right? So those two screws hold in the entire axle assembly through the bearing holding it in. And hell, while we're at it, let's just pull them off and I'll show you. Some aftermarket hex extensions or +4 axles will come with Phillips head screws that are flat. That way these aren't sticking out as much and your hexes are able to go even closer to your bearing without rubbing on these little hex screws. Okay, so there's your axle shaft. All right, it's got a little flat end. That's what goes into your brass gear. Your bearing sits on top of here. All right, this just goes right down in there. If you plan on going in water or mud, you definitely want to put some grease on your bearings and inside your diff a little bit. You don't want to over grease because that'll just cause tons of resistance in your axle, in your diff. So don't over grease, but if you do plan on going in water, there's a whole bunch of things you should do. Greasing your bearings is one of them. Protecting your electronics with some conformal coating is another. And obviously your servo as well. Now, when you're putting these back in, like I always say, don't over tighten. You don't want it to bind up your bearing. One of the easy ways to put these little pins in is to kind of tuck them under your fingernail, and then you can align it and just let it sit. Okay, make sure the pin goes into the groove and you're good to go. Now I want to talk about suspension just a little bit because this seems to be something that a lot of new people, first thing they do is try to adjust their suspension and get more articulation. One of the ways to do that is to move your shock from this top position down onto the frame rail here or here. If you move it here, you're going to be lifting your truck quite a bit. So you're going to see your wheels are going to drop down a lot, your wheels and tires. If you move it here, you're going to have a little bit less of that. And there are aftermarket parts to be able to put your shocks in a bunch of different positions. But lowering your shock will raise your ride height, obviously. Another thing that moving your shock inward, right, as you bend the shocks inward like this, you're going to get more side-to-side articulation or flex. And you can just imagine that if you took the shock and you put it straight flat down and your shock essentially went from this to this, you're going to have a whole ton of articulation. Way too much. Too much articulation is not a good thing. So you want to be careful how much you move it. I would say moving your shock down to here, or probably even better here, is a better move. We're not going to do that right now, but you can do that. So again, just to get a better view, you can move it from here to here. You might be able to use the stock length screw here. I think you can. I think it's long enough to go in and hold your battery trace still. And then the front shock as well. You can move it here. If you want to lower it, you can move it up to here, but then you're going to kind of be off in your rear because there's no way to lower it there. Or move your shock back to this point here. Okay. And you just have to fiddle with it. And every truck's going to be a little bit different, especially the Gladiator compared to the other ones, just because of the length. And yeah, it's just a matter of tinkering, and shock positioning is huge for how the truck sits and how much articulation you get. That's the key, is shock position, really. All right. So we figure we might as well show you the articulation difference. So it looks like about 14.5 millimeters of travel. Okay. And then our fronts. It's basically the same, 14.5 in front and rear. All right, well, remember that number. So just to give you an idea, there's the stock location. Okay, and if you're to move it down to this first hole here, you're going to raise the truck quite a bit, right? So from stock to that hole, and then if we move it to the front hole, it's a little less, but we're going to have more articulation. So it's still raised, but not nearly as much as here. It's kind of hard to see, I know. Or even, I mean, this is horrible. You don't want to put it there. You never want the shocks going backwards or out from the center. You never want them going like this. You always want them going like this. So we'll go ahead and move it from stock to there to this front shock here, front hole. So it'll be a little bit higher than stock, but we'll have more articulation. Okay, and let's go ahead and do the fronts. So here's the stock hole, and then we can move it to this hole here, which does raise it a little bit. It's the only option we have, or you can also put it up here, but then you lower the front, and obviously you're not going to lower the front and raise the rear, but moving it from this position to this position will still actually give you a little bit more articulation, but you're going to rub. But again, we're raising the height in the back, so we're going to have to raise the height in the front a little bit. That'll allow us to put bigger tires on. So going from here to here, and you could even go all the way back here, but it's so far back, it's hard to see. It's all the way back here. Okay? But that's so far back, you're going to bang on your rails, so you don't really want to do that. So we're going to try this position here, and then we will go through and measure our articulation. There's our 2 screws. Save those. Okay. All right, so we're a little higher in the front, but because we moved these back, there's actually going to be less. The shocks it's basically going to be able to droop more, which means it's going to kind of sit lower on the spring. Okay, I'll have to get a side shot here, but it looks low, and it is, or tall, I guess. It's a little bit taller than the fronts, but when I show you the side shot, you're going to see a difference. So here, there's stock. Okay. Pull it down on it so it's max. Okay, that's stock. And that's our little bit of lift. Now again, if you're putting bigger tires on it, this is a no-brainer. But let's show you articulation. So it was 14.5. Now, unfortunately, you might rub a little in the back here. Now we're at basically 19. Almost 20. Okay, so there's a big difference. Just that little move, and you've only gained just a little bit of height, right? It's not like it's way higher, just a little bit. You know, we can even do this. So it looks like our clearance here was about a 12, 12.5 millimeters, and now we're at 16.5. Okay, visually it's not a huge difference, and when it sits, it also sits a little bit lower because there's not as much, because the angle of shock allows more droop, right? So it's actually going to sit a little lower, and I'll show you that in a minute. So let's do the fronts just to see. Again, we were at the same before, 14.5. So it looks like about 19.8 there. So here's our modified ride height. And you can see it's got a lot more articulation, but it still kind of drops down, it droops down, and you end up kind of looking almost basically stock. Right, there's the stock side. And there's our modified side. And you can see the shocks are angled a lot more extreme. Okay. That little adjustment is going to give you a lot more articulation side to side. And you can already see it. See how much more it drops down. So that is not a bad modification. Maybe it's not for everyone, but it's definitely a good option, and it's free. So worth doing on a brand new stock truck. Now we're going to do the other side. All right, we got all 4 done. You can see we've got a lot more articulation. The ride height isn't really much higher. In fact, it might be a little lower. We do have more droop, so it's going to be a little more kind of top wobbly, right? Just a little bit more, which could be bad for rolling and side hilling, but that's where you want to adjust your shocks, your springs and your shocks. So let me show you that. So on almost all the newer models, there's a little sort of washer or adjustment that you can push down to get preload onto your shocks. And that'll help stiffen them up a little bit so that you are not so floppy. And you can put a zip tie in there to hold it. You can actually just bend them down, get some pliers, and you can kind of put a little squeeze on them. If you pop them all the way down, you can maybe just use your hand, just kind of squeeze them. That way they're a little bent, like a little oval shaped versus round, and it'll help hold them on there. You can also take an X-Acto and just score the sides of the shock housing. Wherever you want the line to sit. I put a couple different ones, but now your little washer or adjustment thing will stay. Okay. Sometimes they just stay naturally. You don't have to do anything, but sometimes you got to kind of help them out a little. So you put a little X-Acto slice in that shock housing. You can see a little line there. The washer will sit on it. So it looks good. Now, if after you've done some modifications and whatnot, your truck is riding just too high, but you still want to maintain that articulation, there's some options. One of them is to do limiting straps, which basically the best way to do limiting straps is to do it from the center of the axle at the lowest possible point, then to the frame, and it basically pulls up the axle. And what that allows you to do is still have your left to right articulation without having the shocks unloading on you while you're going up a hill or down a hill. So if you're going up a hill and you've got droop on there, they're kind of sitting like this, and you're going up the hill, and then it starts to unload. That weight will cause your truck to tip back if it's too much unloading, or you're riding too high. So you will put a shock strap or a limiting strap, more specifically, from the center points to the frame. And I'll put a link over here to a video where I show all about limiting straps and more articulation stuff. So check that out for sure. You can also, some people will do what's called force drooping as well. Some people will remove the shocks completely, the springs from the shocks, sorry, and they will put rubber bands around them, and it will force the shocks, it'll force it like this, completely compressed, and it will, if they have, this is once you add weight, if you have a lot of weight on your axles and wheels, then it will still kind of let your truck unload a little bit and give you articulation over rocks and bumps, but it keeps it tucked to the axle or to the frame. And they will put, like I said, they'll put rubber bands around where the shocks go, or on some shocks where there's internal springs, the springs are on the inside of the shock housing, you can actually put the shock on the opposite side of the piston, and the spring will then push on the piston from the top here onto the bottom of the piston, causing it to pull inward. So the spring will actually pull in, and it just basically sucks everything towards the frame. These little trucks aren't real vehicles. The whole point of shocks and springs on real vehicles is to make the ride a little more smooth. But these, you're not riding in them, so you could actually just take out the springs completely, slam it to the ground, try to maintain articulation and clearance, but basically not have any spring in the suspension. So it's all a matter of how you want to do it. There's a ton of different ways to do it, but if you want to maintain springs like this, have a lot of articulation, and you don't want your truck riding too high, again, a limiting strap in the center is a good way to do that, and it'll just pull it in a little bit. You'll still have this here, and you'll still have tons of side to side. See that? This is all stock. Remember, you just open this thing. So back to the wheels, I want to point something out. There's a little nylon ring inside of your nut, okay? You're not trying to tighten the nut all the way down. You can strip this little plastic ring out very easily, and at that point your lugs will just fall off, or your nuts will just fall off. So you're basically, realistically, able to just hand tighten these down. And once the little plastic ring on there is on your axle shaft, that's when it starts to get tight to turn. Okay? And you can just turn it down just a little bit until you start to feel it snug. And as soon as it starts to feel snug, you probably tightened too much already. And you just back off just a little, and you should be able to move it. And you can see here as I move this one moves as well. they're just barely kind of moving. You can almost just blow on it, and it moves, right? That means we're good. And it doesn't have any play side to side. If you want, you can try to tighten it down just a little more. Just a little more. I mean, and I am turning it, you can see, I am turning it that much, right? And I think we're good. Alrighty, guys. I know it's getting kind of long, and if you've already dealt with these trucks for a while, I'm sure this video is not for you. But again, this is more walking through a brand new SCX24 for anybody who's never had one. All right, let's go ahead and get this thing going. So this right here is our battery strap. There's our antenna. I have a video that talks about these electronics pretty in depth. Just so you know, the CLR3 and CLL2 are actually turn signal lights. You can use them to hook in turn signals, and then when you turn your wheel, it'll actually blink left and blink right. So that's what those are for. In the video where I talk about this, which I'll post over here, I mentioned I'm not sure what those are for, but that is what they're for. The head is for headlights. Channel 4 is a channel 4, which right here. Sorry, right here. And then channel 3 is channel 3. This is kind of a toggle switch, and this is a 3-position switch. Okay, middle, left, right, and center. A lot of people will use this for rear steering, which I have a video on here. All right, to our battery. Our battery, if you've never dealt with a LiPo, or at least a 2S LiPo, there are 2 plugs. Anything that's more than a 1S will have 2 plugs, usually. I've seen some 2Ss with just the 1 plug, but that is not common. So 2S is the number of cells in the series. That's why it's an S2 series. And basically it means there's 2 little cells inside of this one battery, and you can see them. There's 1, 2. This is our power. So this pulls power from both cells. This actually is connected to each cell individually. So on a hobby grade charger, you can plug this in and see the voltage of each of the 2 cells. And also, while you're charging with a hobby grade charger, it'll charge through this, but then balance out the charge so that the 2 cells are equally charged through this. And that's some of the problems with some of these cheaper chargers that come with the ready-to-runs, is they don't actually balance charge, even though they plug in through the balance port. Some of them don't. I'm not 100% sure on this new one if it does. I think it does, but again, it's still not ideal. You usually want to charge through here and balance through here. This doesn't plug into anything, so don't get confused when you go to plug your battery in. Only this plugs in, and this is a big deal. If you start messing with things and unplugging things, never, ever plug your battery into where the motor goes. Now, these are exactly the same style plugs, okay? And you can plug your battery into where the motor goes. And as soon as you do, you will see smoke, and you will be done, and you will be buying a new receiver. This is both the receiver for the remote, and it's the speed control for the motor. It's a 2-in-1. So it says 2-in-1 ESC RX. RX stands for receiver, ESC stands for electronic speed control. And it's showing that it can use a 2S LiPo, and it has a BEC of 6 volts or 1 amp, which is kind of its max power out, is 6 volts at 1 amp. Okay, so again, never plug your battery into where your motor goes. Don't accidentally swap it. You upgrade your motor, and then you plug your motor into here, and then plug your battery into there. You're frying your ESC. So, also, if you ever are decasing these, which I have a video over here, know that red goes towards the servos. Think about that. Red, power servos. Black goes to your antenna. Your antenna is black. Your red is your servos. That way, if you ever have to get new batteries, make sure the batteries, if they're not these dynamites, make sure your red is plugging into the front. Your black negative is plugging into the rear. And the motor doesn't matter as much, but it's the same. If you were to switch these two, so your motor's going backwards after you install a new motor, it's because these are swapped. And you can either unsolder it from the back of your motor or pull this out and swap the pins by pushing these little things down, pulling out the cables and swap them and switch the side. The direction these go doesn't matter as far as positive and negative on the motor. It'll just make it spin forward or backwards. If you flip these and you plug them in backwards, you're going to have a bad day again. So make sure your red is to the front, black is to the back. Okay, power servos. All right, so we're on now. Let's go ahead and put our battery in. Before you just throw it on the ground and start running it around, make sure everything is working correctly. Because your body can get caught up. Try to slow crawl it first. Make sure it seems like everything's good. You don't hear any weird noises or anything. All right. Okay. See that little jump happening? You see that? Oh, you know what that is? That's actually our shock rubbing. I thought it was something called binding that was happening with our dog bones. So another thing to do here, and just be aware, if your axles, your dog bones are popping out and you're worried and you're having issues with your dog bones popping out, or you don't even want to risk it, there is a way to turn down what's called your steering dual rate. You can see it right here, STDR. What that does is that minimizes, see if I turn my wheel and I push negative on here, you're going to see the steering go in. Now, that means the max steering angle is this. Okay? You don't want to turn it down all the way, but you do want to turn it down just a little. If you notice the servo here, let me see if you can, you might not be able to see. So one thing you'll notice is when I turn the steering, let's actually turn up our dual rate all the way. Okay, our dual rate's all the way up. You can see as I turn the wheel, when I get to the max, the servo still wants to keep going. You can see right here, the servo saver actually starts to open up. Okay, that's because our wheels and tires are at max turn, but the servo still wants to move. Okay, those are called endpoints. And whenever you install a new servo or anything along those lines, change stuff in your front end geometry, your steering, your tires even, you want to adjust your endpoints, or in this case, dual rate. Okay, so what you can do is you can max turn it and then turn down your dual rate just until the wheels turn back a little bit. Now that means our max turn is not going to put too much strain on our servo, right? A lot of people have issues burning out their servos. And a lot of that has to do with their endpoints being pushed all the way to the end because they want to max their steering, and then they basically are just making their servo, while they're turning, they're like turning and going, and they're just holding it like this, and it's actually frying their servo. So turn your dual rate down just a little. Again, you can max turn it. I would check both sides, and you can turn it up, and you can see it's going to push it just a little bit, but not turn the wheels. That means it's too far. We'll turn it down a little. There you go. And we still have good turning, but we're not causing the servo saver to kick in, and we're not going to burn up our servo. All right. The next thing on here is your throttle trim. Some people have had their rigs just go. As soon as they turn them on, the rig's just like going. Your throttle trim is basically your center point between throttle and reverse. So if we up this, you'll see it's just going to start going all by itself. And if we down it, you'll see it's going to start going in reverse by itself. And you can hear the ESC. Okay, so let's listen very carefully here. Actually, I'm going to put this close to the mic. So I'm going to go ahead and turn up the dual rate or the throttle trim, and before the wheels even turn, you're going to hear the ESC start to kick in. Hear that? That means our throttle trim is too far forward or reverse. So you want to back it off or move it forward if you're too far back. You can hear that even when you're just using the throttle. Okay, so your throttle trim should be turned down or up just enough to where you don't hear that and it doesn't automatically go. All right, the next is steering trim. Steering trim is your center point of your steering left and right. So if you crank up your steering, you'll see the servo will slightly turn. See how it's turning left? And that's how you center your drive. So as you're driving and you notice your truck is kind of veering to the left or right, you use this steering trim to do that. Another thing is these two switches here. One is throttle reverse and one is steering reverse. If you turn and you flip it, you don't have to do it, but just so you can see, if you turn and you flip it, it's going to flip which way it is. So now when I go this way, it's turning that way, and this way is turning that way. If I flip it again, now we're going opposite. So this is how you flip the steering. And the reason they do that is because some servos are built differently, or just different ways things can be set up on a rig. You might need to switch which way is left and right. Okay, same with the throttle. If I flip this, when I give it gas, it's going to go in reverse. That's actually reverse. Now if I flip it again, it's going to go the other way. Okay. And then of course your middle button is your bind button. That's how you bind it to the truck. You can actually bind multiple rigs to a single remote. All you basically do is hold the bind button, turn on the remote, it'll be flashing, then plug in or turn on your rig and it'll bind. Shut off that rig, do the same thing, turn off your remote, hold the bind button, turn it on, plug in the next rig, and now both rigs will be bound at the same time. And yes, you can drive them at the same time, but it's more for if you have like 4 or 5 trucks and you want to use one remote, you can bind them all to one. Just know that it will power and run them all. You can have 5 rigs all driving sort of the same. When you turn left, it'll all turn left, gas, whatever. Okay. I think that's all we've got here. like I said, I go in depth with the difference between the version 1 and the version 2 electronics. Posted again up in the corner here. Another thing of note is anything plugged into the head channel, so your headlights, right, will light up, and it's also controllable through this channel 3. So you can get it to blink by going there, steady, or off. And the new Bronco actually has 2 sets of lights, and one is permanently on. When you turn your rig on, the lights will turn on, and the other is set to this 3-channel, or this channel 3-position switch. Okay, so that is a neat little feature. I hope that helped you in some way. If you're brand new to the SCX24 world, hopefully that gave you some good insight into what you kind of want to look for and just some of the cool stuff about these little trucks. They are a blast. They are really easy to work on. I think they're a great entry point into the RC hobby in general. They're easy to drive. They're not going super fast. So if you're trying to still learn how to use one of these remotes, you know, it's not difficult because they're kind of slow. But crawling is actually a pretty good time. It's about being technical and trying to get up the rocks and find lines and find out the capabilities of your rigs. And low center of gravity is key, so keep that in mind while you're upgrading. You want it as low as possible, and ideally non-rotating, which means not on your wheels and tires. But yeah, if you have any questions, be sure to post your comments below and let us know if you have any questions about anything. We try to get back to all of our questions and comments. Also, if you made it this far, put newbie, N-E-W-B-I-E, in the comments below. Newbie. Just spam those comments with newbie. It actually helps us a little bit in the algorithms, kind of gets our video to show a little higher. And it's just fun to see everybody throw it in there. Maybe use it in a sentence. I don't know. Anyway, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to like. And like I said, any questions, just comment below. We're here to help. That's why I started this channel, is to try to show new people and help people learn about the hobby and just kind of lower that barrier and make people a little bit more comfortable with trying to get into the hobby. We're going to post a video link to a playlist at the end of this video that is to our new Bronco that we had gotten, and we've been doing upgrades on the new Bronco. It's a playlist of a bunch of videos showing free and super cheap mods for the Bronco. Now, most of those mods will work on any of the SCX24 rigs. We show how to make wheel weights on the inside of the wheels here. We mount them in there. They look like rotors. They're made out of lead. We do high clearance links, some repositioning of things to kind of get our weight better. Talk about the shocks, bumper mount adjustments, which could apply to this one too, it looks like. Again, just a lot of really cool little upgrades and mods that are either really, really cheap or just straight up free. So definitely check that out. It's going to be right here at the end.